Would it surprise you to know that the man who once hunted the followers of Christ became the loudest voice for their freedom? When I was permitted to look into the records of the soul, I saw his name burned through the ages, Saul of Tarsus, a man driven by law, consumed by zeal, believing that obedience could purchase holiness. He stood once among the executioners of Stephen, his eyes cold with the certainty of the righteous, his heart bound tighter by every law he memorized. But spirit does not let such men rest, for in the higher planes, where vibration answers vibration, zeal becomes the doorway to transformation. The soul that burns most fiercely in one direction can, when struck by light, burn just as fiercely in another. And so it was that Saul, the hunter, became Paul, the herald. I saw how his story was written long before Damascus ever knew his footsteps. Every soul carries within it the pattern of reversal, the moment when pride meets its reflection and discovers humility. That meeting is never gentle. It breaks the shell of certainty. It blinds the outer eyes so the inner one may see. When the great light surrounded him on that road, it was not punishment but correction, not wrath but revelation. He fell to the earth not because he was overpowered, but because the false ground beneath him gave way. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? The voice did not accuse, it unveiled. For in persecuting others, he had persecuted the light within himself. I tell you, in that moment, the pattern of his soul shifted. The energy that once enforced law began to transmit grace. The record of this transformation is not merely history, it is a template, a map for anyone who has mistaken fear for faith. I saw in the vibrations around Paul's name a current of fierce clarity. He was not a gentle teacher, but a spiritual surgeon. He cut through illusion with the same precision he once used to defend doctrine. And his letter to the Galatians, this battle cry of the Spirit, is not theory, it is emergency. It is the voice of a man who once built cages and now tears them down with both hands. Salvation is by grace through faith, he declared, not by works, not by striving. For he had tried all those ways and found them wanting. He had memorized law, performed rituals, pursued purity, and discovered only exhaustion. When he wrote of freedom, he was not offering poetry, but testimony. He had been inside the prison of perfectionism and found the door already open. The energy of that realization still rings through his words. I can feel it, even now, as a frequency of liberation. It vibrates like a bell struck in eternity. Asterisk. It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Asterisk. That single truth overturns centuries of fear, and yet it remains misunderstood even in our day. For men still seek salvation through effort, through control, through the illusion that God's love must be earned. They build elaborate systems to measure holiness and forget that grace is not a wage but a current one that flows from the heart of God through every awakened soul. In the Akashic fields I was shown, Paul's life appeared like a pendulum, swinging from law to liberty, from shadow to light. Such swings are not accidents. Every extreme of belief creates its opposite, and the divine uses both to educate the soul. When he persecuted, he learned the limits of judgment. When he surrendered, he discovered the power of compassion. You see, the law was his first teacher, but grace was his graduation. Galatians was written from that higher understanding, a vibration born not of intellect but of experience. He did not theorize about mercy. He times became times its witness. And when he wrote to the believers of Galatia, he wrote as one who had bled for truth. His voice carries urgency because he knows how subtle bondage can feel. It wears the disguise of duty, the mask of holiness, yet underneath it hums the same fear. Am I enough? Paul's answer cuts through every generation. No, you are not enough, and you do not need to be, for Christ in you is the sufficiency. That is the revelation that turned a persecutor into a prophet. When I attuned to his vibration, I felt no trace of pride, only awe. The same man who once gloried in his lineage, his discipline, his mastery of law, now gloried in his own undoing. He would later write, "May I never boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ." Do you see the reversal? The symbol of defeat became his crown. The cross, once a curse, became his compass. He understood what few dare to see, that the point of the spiritual path is not moral perfection, but inner surrender. The soul that strives to deserve heaven cannot hear heaven's music. Only the quieted heart can. And that is what Paul learned on that dusty road when the light struck him down and raised him anew. The lesson he brought to the Galatians and through them to us is simple yet inexhaustible. Do not chain yourself to what has already been fulfilled. The law was a tutor, but the Spirit is the life. Freedom is not rebellion. It is alignment with divine rhythm. The law measures, grace flows. The law condemns, grace transforms. The law demands, grace invites. I speak these things not as distant history, but as living pattern. For every soul, sooner or later, must pass through its Damascus moment when the light of truth exposes the false righteousness we cling to. It is painful, yes, but it is the pain of birth. Paul's story endures because it mirrors the journey of consciousness itself, from judgment to mercy, from control to trust, from doing to being. And that is why his name burns still in the records of time, not as the hunter, but as the herald, the one who learned that freedom is not earned, it is remembered. When I turned again to the record, the scene shifted before me, and I beheld the spirit of a man writing under fire, his hand trembling not from age but from outrage, the pulse of his soul beating through every line. And the letter he composed was to a people who had once walked in light, but were now drifting into the gray fog of confusion, the believers in Galatia. They had begun with faith so pure it glowed in the unseen, but as often happens in the story of souls, the echo of freedom had grown faint, and into that silence crept voices that promised certainty in exchange for obedience. False teachers they were called, the Judaizers, men who sought to sew the old garment of the law over the living cloth of grace, stitching back the rips that Christ had already torn open, whispering that salvation was not enough unless it carried the mark of Moses. When I attuned to their vibration, I could feel the heaviness of their persuasion, the sweetness of their reason. It was not open rebellion, but a slow turning, a subtle poison, clothed in reverence. That is how bondage always returns, not with the roar of sin, but with the sigh of respectability. Paul had heard of it through the currents of travelers, through letters passed hand to hand, and the energy of his concern burned like fire through parchment. He could not remain still. To him this was not a minor error, but a collapse of essence, the betrayal of a gospel that had set him free. I saw him pacing in a narrow room, dictating faster than the scribe could follow, his voice sharp as flint. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. The words did not come from temper, but from heartbreak. In the fields of consciousness, truth has its own frequency, and when that frequency is distorted, those attuned to it feel pain, as a musician feels when a note rings false. Paul's pain was the pain of dissonance. He had lived the slavery of the law and knew its smell, its weight, its cold precision that smothers the fire of love. He had seen how men measure holiness by ritual and forget compassion, how they polish rules while the heart rusts beneath. To watch his beloved Galatians trade the living spirit for the dead letter was, to him, watching the crucifixion happen again in slow motion. Yet even in his anger there was compassion, for he understood how easily the human mind clings to structure. Law gives safety, grace gives space. The first builds fences, the second builds wings. And many fear flight more than bondage. In the vibrations of Galatia, I could sense the confusion of those early believers, simple people, many of them Gentiles, who had no history with Jewish custom, no temple, no priesthood, no inherited map to holiness. Paul had given them the gospel of faith, naked and radiant, telling them they were accepted by God not through ceremonies but through trust. And at first it freed them. They prayed with joy, broke bread in love, shared what they had. But then the men of the old order arrived, learned, impressive, clothed in authority, speaking of Abraham and covenant and circumcision. "Do you wish to be true children of God?" they asked. "Then walk in the way of our fathers. And slowly, like a flame covered by too much ash, the brightness of their faith dimmed. I saw it in the record as a shift of light. Their prayers became careful, their worship mechanical, their hearts restless again. They began to doubt their worthiness, to wonder whether grace could really be that simple. And so Paul writes as a father calling to his children lost in a crowd. His words are sharp not to wound but to wake. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? The word times, bewitched times, was not chosen lightly. He saw that their minds had been clouded by illusion, that a spell had been cast not by demons but by doctrine. Every age has its sorceries, and the most dangerous are always those that disguise themselves as righteousness. In truth, the struggle of Galatia was not between Paul and the Judaizers, but between two energies that have contended since man first sought God, the energy of control and the energy of trust. One seeks to master the divine by performance, the other to merge with it by surrender. One looks outward for approval, the other inward for union. The law, in its highest form, was meant to train the will, but when worshipped, it enslaves. Paul had escaped that labyrinth and would not watch others build its walls anew. As I looked deeper, I saw him kneel while dictating, his words now soaked with prayer, and through his spirit the message rose again, timeless and unyielding. It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Those words were not written as metaphor, they were vibration, a living current breaking the crust of fear. For the Galatians, it was an invitation to return to simplicity. For all who would later read it, it is the call to awaken from spiritual exhaustion. I felt the sorrow of Paul not only for them, but for the pattern itself. For he knew this fall would repeat across centuries. Believers beginning in grace and ending in guilt, awakening to love and then binding themselves in rules once more. And so the letter becomes not a defense of doctrine, but a mirror for every soul. In it, he exposes the tendency that lives in all of us, the desire to trade relationship for control, revelation for routine, intimacy for order. He warns that faith cannot coexist with fear, that the moment you measure God's favor by your performance, you have stepped out of freedom's light and back into the long shadow of the law. A person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. To Paul, this was not abstraction, but oxygen. He knew what it felt like to breathe it and to lose it. He wanted his Galatians to breathe again, to remember the freshness of grace, to feel again the inner fire that no ritual can produce. And as I read those vibrations, I understood why his words still live. They carry the frequency of deliverance. In them, the soul hears its own possibility. Paul did not speak from borrowed light, he spoke from direct encounter, from revelation that struck him like lightning and rearranged the geometry of his soul. And when I beheld his record in the field of spirit, I saw that moment replayed not as myth, but as vibration. The instant when heaven intersected the mind of a man bound by certainty. On the road to Damascus, he rode as judge, armed with letters of authority, his heart wound tight around the belief that righteousness could be enforced by power. And then, without warning, the light came. It was not sunlight, not fire, not anything that could be measured. It was the radiance of awareness itself, the presence that knows before thought arises. And within that brilliance, a voice, calm yet absolute, spoke the words that would split history. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? In that question, the mirror was turned, and everything he thought he knew dissolved. I saw him fall, not because force pushed him, but because the illusion of separation could not stand before such union. His eyes burned shut, his certainties cracked, and for 3 days he was blind, the symbol of inner sight forming while outer sight failed. He fasted, trembled, waited, heard only his own breathing and the echo of that voice. This is how transformation happens. It is not gained through instruction, but through interruption. The divine must shatter the shell of knowledge to awaken wisdom. When Ananias came, fearful yet obedient, and laid his hands upon the broken persecutor, scales fell like dust, and the vision that opened was not merely of light but of meaning. Paul understood that the one he had resisted was the very life he served unknowingly, that the Christ he hunted in others was the indwelling Christ within himself. The hunter met his reflection, and the two became one. From that day he no longer defended law, he embodied grace. When he later wrote to the Galatians, "I did not receive the gospel from man, nor was I taught it, but by revelation of Jesus Christ. It was no figure of speech, it was simple fact. The message that moved through him did not pass through human lineage, it descended straight from source, unfiltered, alive. I tell you, revelation is not invention. It is memory awakened. Every soul carries within its pattern the same light that struck Paul, but few allow it to blind them first. He surrendered his intellect to the silence of spirit, and in that surrender he was remade. The vibration of his name shifted. Saul, the enforcer, became Paul, the transmitter. His authority was not derived from hierarchy, but from harmony. The energy of his words carried the tone of the higher worlds, where truth is not debated but seen. When he preached, cities trembled, not because his logic was perfect, but because his frequency was pure. He spoke, and the veil between the seen and unseen thinned. In the Akashic current I could feel his pulse still alive, a deep note of conviction vibrating through time, declaring that the gospel he bore was not theory but transmission. And yet men doubted him, as they always doubt those who speak from direct knowing. The Judaizers questioned his authority. The elders measured him by tradition, and Paul answered not with flattery but with fire. He recounted his encounter not to boast, but to establish the origin of the message. If even an angel from heaven should preach another gospel, let him be accursed. Such words are not arrogance, they are defense of purity. When a revelation comes through the soul, it must guard itself against dilution, for the world loves to tame what it cannot explain. Paul refused taming. He stood between heaven and earth as conduit, unwilling to let the message of grace be turned into religion again. His transformation was the gospel embodied, the proof that light does not destroy the sinner but transforms him into a vessel. The man who once demanded conformity now preached liberty. The scholar of law became the mystic of faith. He saw the pattern in all things, that divine life flows not through ritual but through resonance. You can memorize every commandment and still miss the pulse of God. You can build temples, recite prayers, and yet remain blind. What saves is not performance but perception. When he wrote, "A person is justified not by works of the law but through faith," he spoke as one who had lived both sides. The law had been his prison. Grace became his breath. In the field of soul, I watched his vibration expand with each act of surrender until his consciousness spanned both heaven and earth. This is why his letters endure. They were written not merely with ink, but with energy. Each phrase carries the charge of awakening. Each sentence invites the reader into remembrance. He was not teaching doctrine, he was transferring frequency. And when he wrote of his conversion to the Galatians, he was inviting them to find their own Damascus, the moment when pride collapses and the divine voice speaks from within the silence. I felt his humility, his awe, his clarity. He knew that what had happened to him could happen to anyone willing to let go of control. Revelation, he said to me, is not earned, it is accepted. It comes when striving ceases and listening begins. The light still speaks. Only the ears of fear are deaf to it. I understood then why his encounter matters across centuries. It proves that no distance, no darkness, no past belief can bar a soul from the sudden invasion of grace. The persecutor can become prophet, the destroyer healer, the legalist mystic. It is the law of divine polarity that the heart most rigid, once broken, releases the strongest fragrance. In that principle lies the secret of redemption. Paul's story is not exception, but example. The same Christ light that called his name calls yours. The same grace that blinded him waits to open your eyes. What is required is honesty, the courage to face the inner voice that asks, "Why do you persecute me?" And to realize that the one we wound through judgment is always the Christ within. When the answer dawns, the scales fall, and what remains is freedom, a freedom born not of argument but of revelation. When I beheld again the record of that age, the light of understanding opened before me, And I saw how swiftly the shadow of corruption creeps upon the garden of faith once planted in grace. For the hearts of men are restless and ever tempted to improve upon perfection. Paul had spoken to the Galatians of freedom, yet even as his words still echoed through their gatherings, others came among them clothed in piety, smooth of tongue, strong in appearance, bearing scrolls and arguments. And the people listened as children listen to the sound of certainty. These men were the Judaizers, guardians of the old order, who proclaimed that the gospel of Christ was noble but incomplete. Faith is holy, they said, but law is eternal, and the covenant cannot be broken. Circumcision, feasts, and observances must remain, lest men fall into error. And I saw the minds of the believers begin to waver, for they had no anchor but the word of Paul, and these new teachers spoke with the weight of tradition. Thus began the drifting, subtle and slow, the exchanging of liberty for security, of spirit for structure. I tell you truly, every generation faces this same test, for the soul finds grace too vast to grasp, and seeks instead the comfort of boundaries. But Paul, sensing the storm, rose again in holy anger. He wrote with the flame of prophecy, his words burning through parchment, crying, "If even we, or an angel from heaven, preach another gospel than that which you received, let him be accursed." The tone of that voice shook the heavens, for it was not the voice of one man, but of truth itself defending its purity. As I looked into his spirit, I saw that this defense was not born of pride, but of love. He had tasted the bondage of law and could not endure to see others chained by it again. His heart cried for them as a shepherd for his flock lost among thorns. He did not debate the Judaizers with clever speech. He struck at the root. "Do you not remember," he wrote, "that the Spirit came not through works, but through faith?" He reminded them of their first joy, when miracles rose among them like spring flowers, when they prayed and the sick were healed, not because they performed rituals, but because their faith was alive. "You foolish Galatians," he said, "who has bewitched you?" And in that word, times bewitched times, lies the mystery of all spiritual error. For every false teaching begins as enchantment, a subtle glamour cast upon the mind, turning the gaze from the living God to the glitter of rules and rewards. The spell of religion is older than Babylon, and its essence is always the same: to replace inner communion with outer ceremony. I saw how the spirit of fear cloaked itself in holiness and whispered, "Surely God requires more." And when that whisper is believed, grace is forgotten. The Galatians, once radiant in freedom, now measured their righteousness by customs they never knew before. They began to fast by schedule, to abstain by order, to bow by rule, and in all this discipline the light of joy dimmed. Paul felt their fading as a wound in his own body, for the bond between teacher and student is energetic, and when one falls into confusion, the other feels the tremor. So he wrote with urgency, not as a scholar, but as a man who sees fire approaching his house. He reminded them that Abraham was declared righteous before the law existed, that the covenant of faith preceded the covenant of works, that grace was the first and final order. He warned that to add anything to the gospel was to subtract its power, for the divine does not need amendment. "Mark my words," he wrote, "if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you." These were not threats, but diagnoses, for the law and grace cannot reign together. One must yield. As I watched this unfold, I felt the deep sorrow of heaven, for it is the sorrow of love misunderstood. The same Christ who died to free men from the burden of law now saw his followers rebuilding the very yoke he had broken. The irony of the ages: that man ever prefers the chain he can see to the liberty he must trust. Yet in every age, too, there arises a voice like Paul's, fierce and tender, crying that freedom is not rebellion, but restoration. I was shown then that this battle between law and grace is not confined to doctrines or churches. It is the daily struggle of the heart. Within every soul, the same two voices speak: the inner Judaizer, demanding proof, and the inner Christ, offering peace. And each day we choose which shall govern. When Paul spoke of freedom, he did not mean anarchy, but harmony, the soul moving with divine rhythm rather than human rule. "It is for freedom that Christ has set you free," he declared, And I heard in that sentence the eternal command of Spirit. Awaken, remember who you are, cease to serve fear. For fear is the true lawgiver. It writes its commandments upon the mind and punishes the least disobedience. The Galatians had not merely adopted rituals, they had returned to fear. Their faith, once born of trust, had curdled into anxiety, and thus they sought safety and structure. Paul, wise in the ways of the soul, knew that until fear is cast out, grace cannot rule. So his letter becomes both sword and salve. It cuts the lie, then heals the wound. He tells them they are children of promise, heirs of freedom, no longer slaves. And I saw that these words were not his alone. They were the voice of the living Christ, speaking through him to all who would read thereafter. The battle of Galatia is our own. The law may change its garments, but the chain is always the same. The belief that we must earn what was already given. I tell you, faith is not effort, it is remembrance. To believe is to recall what the soul knew before fear began. Abraham was the proof Paul needed, the living key that unlocked the mystery of grace hidden beneath centuries of law. And when I beheld the record of that covenant, I saw not a man of perfection, but a man of faith, trembling beneath the stars, daring to believe the invisible. Paul invoked his name to tear down the fortress of ritual, declaring that Abraham was justified long before the law existed, long before circumcision became a seal of identity, for his righteousness was not earned but credited by trust. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. That single sentence shattered the pride of those who thought holiness could be measured. It reminded the Galatians, and all generations after them, that the divine relationship is not transaction, but transformation. Faith is not a wage, it is an awakening. In the currents of the soul, belief is vibration, and Abraham's faith vibrated so strongly that heaven echoed back to him with covenant. He stood under the night sky with nothing to show but a promise, and yet he acted as though it were already fulfilled. That is the meaning of justification by faith, to live from what is unseen as though it were already real. Paul saw that this pattern was the root of the gospel itself. The Judaizers wanted to drag the people back to law, to the tutor that teaches but never graduates. Paul reached further back, to the beginning, to the moment before rules, to the trust that births creation. He showed that Abraham's lineage was spiritual, not biological, that the true children of Abraham were not those marked in flesh, but those marked in consciousness. Those who have faith are children of Abraham, he wrote. And in that revelation, the boundaries between Jew and Gentile, old and new, flesh and spirit, began to dissolve. I tell you, this is not history alone, but metaphysics. The law operates by cause and effect, but faith operates by alignment. Under law, a man obeys and then receives. Under faith, he believes and thereby becomes. The two systems cannot coexist, for one demands sight, while the other demands surrender. Abraham was not righteous because he succeeded, but because he trusted even when he failed. He doubted, he delayed, he laughed at impossibility, yet his trust outlived his weakness. This is why the covenant held. It was written not on stone, but in vibration. Paul understood that the law was never meant to replace faith, but to reveal its necessity. The law was our guardian until Christ came, he said, meaning that law teaches the soul the futility of self-salvation. It exposes pride not to condemn, but to prepare. When the heart finally exhausts its striving, grace enters as breath enters lungs. Abraham's story is the prelude to that breath. He became the prototype of all who would trust the unseen voice more than the visible circumstance. When I read Paul's words in the record, I could feel their power as a corrective to every age. Men still crave rules, still seek to secure themselves by ritual, yet the pattern of Abraham calls them back to faith. For what use is circumcision if the heart remains hard? What use is purity if the mind is bound by fear? The righteousness of law is external. The righteousness of faith is inward resonance with divine order. Abraham believed, and the vibration of that belief rippled through generations until it reached Christ, the perfect manifestation of trust. The promise made beneath the stars was fulfilled upon the cross. Paul saw this continuum clearly, and it filled him with awe. He realized that grace was not a new doctrine, but the oldest truth, older than Sinai, older than Moses, older even than creation's first light, for grace is the substance by which God relates to his own. The law was temporary scaffolding, grace the structure eternal. And so, when Paul pleaded with the Galatians to abandon works, he was not abolishing morality, but restoring proportion. The law reveals the disease, grace provides the cure. To cling to law after grace has come is to keep wearing the bandage after the wound is healed. I saw how his words pierced their conscience like thunder. No one who relies on the law is justified before God, because the righteous shall live by faith. The simplicity of it terrified them. Freedom always does. Men prefer systems they can count to mysteries they must trust. But Paul, illuminated by revelation, refused to dilute the gospel to comfort their fear. He told them plainly that the law could never justify, for it deals only with conduct, not condition. The soul is not saved by action, but by union, by returning to the frequency of divine love. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, he declared, by becoming a curse for us. That curse is the weight of separation, the belief that we must earn what can only be received. When Christ took that burden, he ended the commerce between heaven and earth and replaced it with communion. This was what Paul lived and died to defend. I watched him through the current of time, his heart blazing with the same faith as Abraham's, his spirit bridging law and grace, old and new, flesh and eternity. He saw that all religion collapses into this single question: do you trust God's promise more than your own performance? That is the hinge upon which destiny turns. The Galatians struggled with it, as every soul does, but Paul's voice called them back to remembrance, reminding them that faith is not weakness, but the highest strength. It is the power that moves reality because it aligns with divine will. Abraham's story, he said, is not past, but prophecy. For every believer must one day stand beneath their own sky of impossibility and hear the whisper, "Look up, count the stars if you can, so shall your promise be." Adoption is the hidden jewel of Paul's revelation, the divine exchange that transforms servants into sons and exiles into heirs. And when I beheld its record in the field of spirit, I saw that it was not mere metaphor, but living law, written in the structure of the soul. Paul declared that in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that they might receive adoption as sons. And in those words lies the axis upon which human destiny turns. For law may restrain, but only love can transform, and adoption is love transfiguring identity. The Galatians had known slavery, the bondage of law, the tyranny of guilt, the endless struggle to earn what could only be received, but Paul's voice tore through that fog with revelation. You are no longer slaves, but children of God, and if children, then heirs. This was not sentimental language. It was a spiritual decree. In Roman law, adoption meant more than belonging. It meant transfer of authority, erasure of old debts, inheritance of new name and future. The adopted one ceased to belong to the former life, and that is the vibration Paul described. The soul that receives Christ does not merely believe, it is reclassified in the universe. The old lineage of fear ends, a new lineage of faith begins. The Spirit of the Son enters, crying from within, "Abba, Father." That cry is not recitation, it is recognition, the awakening of divine memory long buried under centuries of separation. I tell you truly, this is the secret pulse of redemption, the realization that man was never servant by nature, but son by design. Sin is not only wrongdoing, it is amnesia. The Christ came to restore memory. When the Spirit whispers, "Abba," the soul remembers its source, and remembrance is salvation. Paul saw this mystery as the crown of grace, for law could command conduct, but could never confer kinship. It could regulate behavior, but could not rewrite being. Adoption does what law cannot. It changes essence. The slave obeys because he fears. The son obeys because he loves. The slave works for reward. The son serves from inheritance. The slave prays to be heard. The son communes because he is known. Such is the radical transformation Paul sought to awaken in his Galatian children, that they might cease laboring as petitioners and begin living as heirs. When I felt the vibration of his words, It was as if chains fell through centuries, for his voice carried not persuasion but power. He was calling humanity to step out of the orphanhood of the flesh into the certainty of spirit. He told them that Christ's coming was not simply deliverance from law, but entry into family, that redemption was not transaction, but adoption, sealed by the indwelling Spirit. I saw how this truth glowed like a sun within his consciousness. Paul, once the enforcer of rules, now became the herald of relationship. He who once terrified believers now tenderly called them brothers and sisters. The vibration of his heart had changed, from judgment to joy, from command to communion. He taught that the Spirit's indwelling is not external authority, but internal intimacy. The Father is no longer a figure upon a throne, but presence within the heart, and the proof of sonship is not ritual, but resonance. Because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, he wrote, and that Spirit is the living witness crying, Abba, not as repetition, but as revelation. In that cry, the soul is reborn. The chains of fear fall silent, and love takes their place. I tell you, this truth is more powerful than law, for love requires no guardrails. It governs from within. The Judaizers could not comprehend such intimacy. They desired distance, for distance preserves control. They wanted a God enthroned in majesty, reachable only by ceremony, for such a God can be managed by intermediaries. But the gospel of adoption destroys hierarchy. It declares that every soul has direct access to the throne, that the curtain has been torn, that heaven is no longer a far country but a state of consciousness within the awakened heart. This was the revolution Paul proclaimed. It was not rebellion against order, but restoration of origin. Humanity, long enslaved to outer forms, was being invited into inward union. The Spirit testifies not by thunder, but by tenderness. It convinces not by threat, but by truth. The law said, obey and live. Grace says, live, and you will obey. The difference is infinite, and it defines the line between religion and relationship. When I saw Paul's vision unfold, I understood why he called them heirs. To be an heir is to possess what has already been given, to hold promise before fulfillment, to walk in the certainty of unseen wealth. The inheritance of the Spirit is not gold, not land, not power, but participation in divine nature. The heir does not strive, he receives. He does not fear loss, he abides in abundance. That is the meaning of adoption, to live from the awareness of belonging, to cease begging at the gates of heaven and realize the gates were never closed. Paul's tone, once stern, became pleading when he wrote, stand firm then, and do not be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. For he knew how easily the orphan mind returns to fear. Even adopted children, until they trust the Father's love, still flinch at the sound of command. That is why the Spirit must teach them daily that they are safe, loved, chosen. The Spirit's work is to transform obedience from duty into delight. This is the new covenant, written not with ink but with presence. The Spirit does not remind of guilt. He reminds of grace. He does not accuse. He affirms. He is the whisper of belonging that no law can silence. Adoption is the hidden jewel of Paul's revelation, the divine exchange that transforms servants into sons and exiles into heirs. And when I beheld its record in the field of spirit, I saw that it was not mere metaphor but living law, written in the structure of the soul. Paul declared that in the fullness of time God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law so that they might receive adoption as sons, and in those words lies the axis upon which human destiny turns. For law may restrain, but only love can transform, and adoption is love transfiguring identity. The Galatians had known slavery, the bondage of law, the tyranny of guilt, the endless struggle to earn what could only be received, but Paul's voice tore through that fog with revelation. You are no longer slaves, but children of God, and if children, then heirs. This was not sentimental language. It was a spiritual decree. In Roman law, adoption meant more than belonging. It meant transfer of authority, erasure of old debts, inheritance of new name and future. The adopted one ceased to belong to the former life, and that is the vibration Paul described. The soul that receives Christ does not merely believe. It is reclassified in the universe. The old lineage of fear ends. A new lineage of faith begins. The Spirit of the Son enters, crying from within, Abba, Father. That cry is not recitation. It is recognition, the awakening of divine memory long buried under centuries of separation. I tell you truly, this is the secret pulse of redemption, the realization that man was never servant by nature but son by design. Sin is not only wrongdoing, it is amnesia. The Christ came to restore memory. When the Spirit whispers Abba, the soul remembers its source, and remembrance is salvation. Paul saw this mystery as the crown of grace, for law could command conduct but could never confer kinship. It could regulate behavior but could not rewrite being. Adoption does what law cannot, it changes essence. The slave obeys because he fears, the son obeys because he loves. The slave works for reward, the son serves from inheritance. The slave prays to be heard, the son communes because he is known. Such is the radical transformation Paul sought to awaken in his Galatian children, that they might cease laboring as petitioners and begin living as heirs. When I felt the vibration of his words, it was as if chains fell through centuries, for his voice carried not persuasion but power. He was calling humanity to step out of the orphanhood of the flesh into the certainty of spirit. He told them that Christ's coming was not simply deliverance from law but entry into family, that redemption was not transaction but adoption sealed by the indwelling Spirit. I saw how this truth glowed like a sun within his consciousness. Paul, once the enforcer of rules, now became the herald of relationship. He who once terrified believers now tenderly called them brothers and sisters. The vibration of his heart had changed, from judgment to joy, from command to communion. He taught that the Spirit's indwelling is not external authority, but internal intimacy. The Father is no longer a figure upon a throne, but presence within the heart. And the proof of sonship is not ritual, but resonance. Because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, he wrote. And that Spirit is the living witness crying Abba, not as repetition, but as revelation. In that cry the soul is reborn. The chains of fear fall silent, and love takes their place. I tell you, this truth is more powerful than law, for love requires no guardrails. It governs from within. The Judaizers could not comprehend such intimacy. They desired distance, for distance preserves control. They wanted a God enthroned in majesty, reachable only by ceremony, for such a God can be managed by intermediaries. But the gospel of adoption destroys hierarchy. It declares that every soul has direct access to the throne, that the curtain has been torn, that heaven is no longer a far country, but a state of consciousness within the awakened heart. This was the revolution Paul proclaimed. It was not rebellion against order, but restoration of origin. Humanity, long enslaved to outer forms, was being invited into inward union. The Spirit testifies not by thunder, but by tenderness. It convinces not by threat, but by truth. The law said, obey and live. Grace says, live and you will obey. The difference is infinite, and it defines the line between religion and relationship. When I saw Paul's vision unfold, I understood why he called them heirs. To be an heir is to possess what has already been given, to hold promise before fulfillment, to walk in the certainty of unseen wealth. The inheritance of the Spirit is not gold, not land, not power, but participation in divine nature. The heir does not strive, he receives. He does not fear loss, he abides in abundance. That is the meaning of adoption, to live from the awareness of belonging, to cease begging at the gates of heaven and realize the gates were never closed. Paul's tone, once stern, became pleading when he wrote, stand firm then, and do not be burdened again by a yoke of slavery, for he knew how easily the orphan mind returns to fear. Even adopted children, until they trust the Father's love, still flinch at the sound of command. That is why the Spirit must teach them daily that they are safe, loved, chosen. The Spirit's work is to transform obedience from duty into delight. This is the new covenant, written not with ink but with presence. The Spirit does not remind of guilt, he reminds of grace. He does not accuse, He affirms. He is the whisper of belonging that no law can silence. I saw that this truth, once received, changes how a man lives. He ceases to compete, to compare, to condemn. He serves not to prove himself, but to express what he already is. Every act becomes worship, every moment communion, for the Father and the child share one life. Freedom was the heartbeat of Paul's message, and when I beheld his record in the Book of Life, I saw that this freedom was not an idea but a vibration, a divine current, running through the soul of every man who dares to walk by the Spirit. He wrote, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free." And in those words I heard the echo of creation itself. For freedom is the law of heaven, and bondage the invention of fear. The Galatians had tasted this freedom once. They had known the joy of salvation, not bound by rules, not measured by ritual, but born of faith and love. Yet, as I have seen in many ages, the soul that awakens soon forgets its liberty and begins to rebuild the prison it escaped. They began to doubt the simplicity of grace, thinking, as men always think, that something so great must demand payment. And so they traded peace for performance, life for law, the spirit for the flesh. Paul's heart ached as he wrote to them, for he had walked that road himself, the long road of striving, the endless climb toward an unreachable perfection. He knew the exhaustion that comes from measuring one's worth before God by works, and he cried out to them, "Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh?" In that question lies the essence of the human condition, the temptation to finish by effort what began by grace. When I gazed into the current of that moment, I saw how the soul wars against itself. The spirit within longs for freedom, but the mind, shaped by fear, demands control. The flesh does not mean the body alone. It means the self that lives by its own strength, that trusts in its own virtue, that seeks approval rather than union. To live by the flesh is to live in opposition to the Spirit, for the two move in contrary directions. Paul spoke not as philosopher, but as one who had felt the battle within his own heart. The desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. It is not a battle of good against evil, but of freedom against fear. The flesh seeks power, the Spirit seeks peace. The flesh demands proof, the Spirit moves by faith. The flesh clings to form, the Spirit breathes life into form and moves on. The Galatians, caught between these two, began to falter. Some turned back to the old rituals, believing that outward observance could preserve inward purity. Others used liberty as license, mistaking grace for indulgence. Paul, seeing both errors, spoke with fire and tenderness. "You were running well," he wrote. "Who hindered you from obeying the truth?" In that cry, I felt his love, his fatherly sorrow, his holy urgency. He knew that spiritual bondage often hides beneath the mask of devotion. It is possible, I tell you, to pray and still be bound, to serve and still be afraid, to sing and yet not be free. True liberty is not rebellion, but surrender, not the casting off of order, but the alignment with divine rhythm. To walk by the Spirit is not to live without guidance, but to be guided from within by a law written upon the heart rather than carved upon stone. I saw in the record that this freedom is not fragile. It is fierce. It demands vigilance, for bondage is patient and cunning. It whispers, just one more rule, one more vow, one more safeguard. And soon the soul is once again weighed down by chains forged from good intentions. That is why Paul warned, "Stand firm, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." The yoke he spoke of was invisible, made of fear, pride, and guilt. The enemy of the Spirit does not need to tempt men with sin. He only needs to convince them that grace must be earned. I tell you, this lie has undone more saints than all temptations of the flesh combined. For when the soul believes it must labor for love, it ceases to rest in God. Paul saw this clearly. He wrote that those who walk by the Spirit will not gratify the desires of the flesh, for the Spirit changes the root of desire itself. The law can restrain, but the Spirit transforms. The law says, "Do not steal." The Spirit teaches generosity. The law says, "Do not kill." The Spirit births compassion. The law forbids, the Spirit fulfills. And the fruit of that Spirit, as Paul revealed, is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These are not duties, but evidences, the natural outgrowth of divine life within. I have seen them in those who truly walk with God, the quiet radiance, the steady calm, the absence of fear. Such souls need no law, for love has become their nature. They do not strive to be good. They are good because they are free. This is the mystery of grace. It does not abolish effort. It sanctifies it. The Galatians feared that without rules they would fall into sin, but Paul knew that sin begins not in freedom but in fear. He wrote, "The whole law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love, not law, is the guardrail of heaven. When a man loves, he cannot harm. When he walks in spirit, he fulfills the law without even thinking of it." I saw that Paul's teaching was not for his age alone, but for all time. For men still labor under the same delusion that holiness is achieved through struggle rather than surrender. The Spirit does not abolish discipline. It transforms discipline into delight. Prayer ceases to be obligation and becomes breath. Service ceases to be duty and becomes joy. Forgiveness ceases to be burden and becomes nature. That is life in the Spirit. It is not perfection but participation, not rule but relationship. The Spirit is the pulse of the Father beating within the heart of the Son, guiding, correcting, empowering, until even weakness becomes strength. Paul lived this truth, for he no longer gloried in his works, but in his dependence. Those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. That crucifixion is not self-denial alone, it is self-surrender, the death of pride and the birth of peace. When I looked upon the vibration of those who live this way, I saw their souls as rivers strong, steady, unresisting, flowing where the Spirit wills. They do not fear the future, for they have learned that God is not against them, but within them. That is freedom, the end of resistance, the harmony of will and love. And so Paul's cry through the ages remains, "If we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit." To stand firm in freedom is the hardest act of faith, for the soul, once released from chains, still carries the memory of bondage, and memory is a subtle master. Paul knew this truth and wrote with the fire of one who had wrestled it in his own heart. "You are called to be free," he told the Galatians, "but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love." In that sentence lies the balance of grace, the liberty that does not decay into chaos, the obedience that does not collapse into fear. Freedom is not escape, it is alignment. It is the soul learning to act from love rather than compulsion. I have seen in the record of souls how freedom misused turns to bondage again, for the heart that mistakes liberty for license quickly returns to slavery of another kind. And so Paul warned them, stand firm. To stand is no passive act. It is an inward decision renewed daily. The law enslaves through fear of punishment. The flesh enslaves through hunger for pleasure, but the Spirit frees through the harmony of love. The man led by the Spirit is not without law. He is law in motion, for his heart beats with divine rhythm. I felt in Paul's vibration the tenderness of a father who pleads for his children to remain awake. "You were running well," he cried. "Who cut in on you?" He saw how easily spiritual progress is hindered by distraction, by persuasion, by pride dressed as wisdom. The Galatians had begun in joy but were drifting into confusion. Paul knew the pattern it repeats through the ages. Every revival of spirit is soon shadowed by religion. Every awakening is followed by rules to manage the fire. Yet the flame of grace cannot be managed. It must be tended, not tamed. That is why he reminded them that faith working through love is the only measure that counts. Circumcision, uncircumcision, tradition, status, all are dust. Only the transformation of the heart endures. I tell you, the Spirit's freedom is not lawlessness. It is order born from within. When love governs, no external command is required. The Spirit instructs without words, corrects without condemnation, and leads without coercion. But this freedom must be guarded, for the enemy of the soul seeks to replace grace with performance. The little yeast, Paul said, leavens the whole dough, and I saw how true that is. One compromise with fear can infect the entire faith. One return to self-reliance can choke the flow of spirit. Freedom requires vigilance, not anxiety, but awareness. The free soul watches its own motives, not to judge, but to remain clear. Paul, like a prophet, knew the danger of confusion. He said plainly, "If you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you." That was no rejection of ritual, but a defense of essence. To add to grace is to subtract from it. To mix self-effort with divine gift is to turn wine back into water. The cross is sufficient. The resurrection is complete. Man can contribute nothing but consent. Yet consent must be continual, for the ego rebuilds quickly. I saw in the vibration of the Galatians how the old patterns clung to them, the desire to prove holiness, the comfort of comparison, the addiction to being right. Paul's words cut through all these illusions. He wrote, "The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Faith without love becomes fanaticism. Love without faith dissolves into sentiment. The two together form the living current of freedom. When the Spirit rules, even correction becomes compassion." Paul urged them to serve one another, not from duty but delight. He knew that true liberty is never solitary. The free man becomes a healer, bearing the burdens of others, restoring those who fall. "Carry each other's burdens," he wrote, "and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." Thus freedom is proven, not by independence, but by interdependence. The law of Christ is the law of love, and in love there is no pride, no hierarchy, no striving for recognition. Each soul becomes a vessel of grace, pouring into others what it has received. I saw that this is the secret of endurance. The isolated spirit withers, but the one who serves grows strong. Even suffering transforms when shared. Paul's vision of community was not of uniformity, but unity, many hearts, one spirit, each unique yet in harmony. Such freedom requires humility, for pride is the silent thief of grace. If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, Paul warned, he deceives himself. The Spirit teaches this lesson again and again until humility becomes joy. In the world of spirit, the greatest are those who love most. Freedom is not glory, but gentleness. The mark of maturity is not how high one climbs, but how deeply one bows. I have seen those who claim liberty yet live bound by ego. Their faith is noise without power. But those who walk humbly in spirit, though unseen by men, shine like quiet suns. Their freedom is not declared but felt. It radiates peace. Paul bore that peace in scars. He knew freedom's price, loneliness, rejection, persecution, but he also knew its reward, the unshakable joy of belonging to Christ. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What counts is the new creation. That was his creed, his heartbeat, his song. The new creation is not a future promise, but a present reality, wherever spirit rules the heart. It is the rebirth of consciousness, the end of striving, the unveiling of divine identity. Those who live in this awareness cannot be enslaved again. The world may bind their bodies, but not their spirits. Their allegiance is to a kingdom within, invisible yet invincible. That is why Paul could face chains and still speak of liberty, could endure wounds and still bless his persecutors. Freedom is not the absence of pain, but the mastery of perspective. The soul that knows it belongs to God cannot be imprisoned by circumstance. It walks through fire and remains unburned. And so Paul's command resounds through the ages. Stand firm. Stand in faith when fear whispers. Stand in love when anger tempts. Stand in grace when guilt accuses. Stand in freedom, for it was bought with blood and sealed with spirit. When I closed the record of Galatians, the vibration lingered like the echo of a bell, deep, steady, unending. What Paul had written was not a letter. It was a mirror for every soul that has ever longed for peace and mistook effort for holiness. I sat in stillness and felt his spirit beside me, not as a figure of history, but as a living teacher. His presence calm, resolute, burning with that strange gentleness born only of surrender. The cross, he whispered, was not an end but a revelation. It shows what love will endure to awaken freedom. And as I looked within, I saw how the same struggle lives in all of us, the desire to be worthy, the fear of not enough, the endless turning of the mind that seeks to purchase what was freely given. Freedom, I learned, is not found in victory but in acceptance. Grace is not a doctrine but a current, and those who yield to it are carried into peace. I understood then that Paul's journey was humanity's own. From law to love, from striving to surrender, from servant to son. Every soul must walk that road, and none can shorten it by theory. The law will break you until grace remakes you. The letter will bind you until spirit breathes within it. And when the heart finally cries, Abba, the distance between heaven and earth collapses into one beat of recognition. I saw that Paul's scars were not marks of failure, but of passage. To follow truth always costs the comfort of illusion. He bore that cost with joy, for he had found the secret that ends fear. I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. That is the voice of the awakened soul, the one who no longer strives to reach God because he has discovered God as the life within his own breath. I realize that all of creation echoes that same pattern. The seed must die to sprout. The wave must fall to rise. The heart must surrender to know strength. Law disciplines, grace fulfills, and love completes. These are not stages of religion, but phases of consciousness. I tell you truly, the soul evolves not through conquest, but through consent. It grows by yielding, not by winning. Paul had learned this, and through him the Spirit carved a message that no empire could silence. Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What counts is the new creation. That new creation is what I have seen in those who awaken to their divine origin. No longer ruled by fear, no longer divided by dogma, but radiant with quiet certainty. They do not preach freedom, they embody it. Their presence heals without effort, for it carries the fragrance of grace. I sat in that awareness, and the final truth unfolded. The Gospel of Galatians is not about law versus faith, Jew versus Gentile, old versus new. It is about consciousness itself learning to remember its source. When man ceases to measure himself, he becomes what he already was, image of the infinite. In that knowing, the battle ends. The law is fulfilled. The striving ceases. The orphan returns home. Paul called it grace. I call it harmony. It is the same river flowing through every soul, waiting to be remembered. And I heard the Spirit say, as it said to him long ago, stand firm, but not in fear. Stand in love. That is the final command, the only one that endures when all else passes. As I let the vision fade, I felt a great stillness cover me, the kind that does not ask, does not prove, but simply knows. The letter of Galatians had ended, but its voice remained, speaking in the silence of my heart. You are free, not by merit, but by memory, not by effort, but by essence. Walk in that remembrance, and every law will be fulfilled. That was Paul's legacy, the crystallization of faith into knowing, the music of grace echoing through time. And as I rose from the vision, I carried with me not a message to teach, but a truth to live, that love, once awakened, is the only law left in heaven or on earth.